ladies and gentlemen, would you please give the warmest of welcomes to Sir Peter Fahy. So welcome to Bolton University. And normally I start in a fairly light-hearted way, but I think with the events of the weekend there's nowhere else to start but what happened in Paris on Friday. And a result of that, what the security response here will be. For instance, there was a meeting of Cobra this morning, chaired by the Home Secretary, at which I'm sure the Association of Chief Police Officers were represented. From your knowledge, what would have happened there at that meeting before we see how that would come out towards Manchester?
Well, I mean, after an attack like that, there's always a certain reaction which is sort of set piece in terms of ministers have to be seen to be doing something, and therefore, you know, chair the meetings and clearly deal with some of the concerns. And I would imagine particularly look at what support could be given to the French authorities and what reassurance can be given to the public. But I suppose it's always fascinating. It is in the very nature of terrorism that it often produces a sort of irrational emotional response, which is fully understandable. You know, we all feel hugely emotional about what happened in Paris. But you know, clearly there is a long-term response to that. There is a long-term security picture, which to some extent will have not been changed by what happened in Paris. Bits will be added to it, but the security services in this country were always aware, particularly after the attack in Mumbai, which really was the attack which changed the situation, where there was marauding people with serious firearms. You know, the services have always been prepared for that. And I suppose we've got a little bit more distance since what happened on Friday. And I suppose my reflections are, it's always interesting when you've done a lot of work with the Muslim community, how you understand that they will see things slightly differently. So they will be absolutely shocked at what happened in Paris, but they'll also be thinking there were bombs in Beirut, there were bombs in Baghdad. You know, was there the same concern about those? And then you look at what happened in France and Paris, and what strikes you again is that the assailants which have been identified clearly were known to the authorities, some pretty well known to the authorities. So it's about the whole issue about when there are suspicions about people, how they are monitored, how you get people in the community to give information about them, Gordon. And then the third aspect is it is about communication. Those people carrying out those attacks will have had to communicate, they'll have had to coordinate, they'll have had to communicate in the run-up to that and the preparation. They'll have had to communicate on the night in terms of how they carried out those awful attacks. And clearly, it would appear the French authorities were not capable, were not able to break that communication. And so, from that whole piece, you draw out, we have to invest in the latest capability to deal with modern communications, and that's where places like this university come into it. But you also have to have very good, you have to try and have good relations with your local communities, again with institutions like, universities, schools, colleges, mosques, places of worship, to know what is going on. Because ultimately, the moment of truth isn't so much about, is there going to be a member of the public who wanders down a street and sees a bomb at the side? Pretty unlikely. It's that moment of truth today when perhaps there's a teacher in a school who's thinking, that young lad, he's really changed his behaviour. Suddenly, he's suddenly become much more interested in quite extreme politics. He's no longer interested in football. He's no longer interested in I don't know, pop music or anything, and is willing to do that bit more, explore, follow up, perhaps talk to other teachers, talk to the lad's mates to say, what's going on here, and if necessary, be prepared to report that. And it's that's the actual moment of truth, which often good policing and terrorist policing relies upon. And what we've seen over the last year is more reports from places like schools and local councils and youth workers and just people in the community telling the police and security services just about people who are possibly of interest. And it doesn't mean they're immediately going to get arrested and prosecuted and their houses searched. It's just in the same way that we deal with any information about a young person, which may be about the fact that they may be subject to sexual abuse or whatever. You talk to teachers, you talk to professionals, you operate with safeguarding procedures, and you try and put in a program, hopefully to divert that person.
It's a difficult, sensitive area, that, though, isn't it? Because if schools or places like universities like this see somebody that is drawn to their attention a bit, and they ring up the police and say, no, we're a bit worried about him, etc., and you then start to investigate that, and he realises, or his family realise, that it was the university or the school that led on to the police, and in fact he's totally innocent of all that, that becomes very difficult.
Well, it can become difficult, but again, it's about the way that that's handled. I mean, I hope a university like this wouldn't, in a way, have to ring the police, that they had to have good relations with the local police coming in to start to have that conversation and part of normal safeguarding. But it's exactly the same as in a school today, a teacher's giving a sex education lesson, and there's one lad sitting there who says that rape in marriage is okay, or says that all homosexuals are sinful and should be stoned or something. Now again, a teacher will use their common sense to say, is this just bravado, or is this something more worrying? Is this something that the teachers in the school can deal with in terms of putting this lad straight? Or is possibly it feeling so worrying that they might worry this lad is going to go out and attack somebody tonight, and therefore they will probably ring the police, Gordon? And these conversations go on every single day between schools, between professionals, between nurseries, between police and social services, teachers and social services. That's what goes on. But it's just interesting when you, exactly as you say, when you start using, when it's about terrorism, it suddenly creates a whole different set of emotions, and part of it is trying to break into that and say, no, this is about what we do, hopefully day to day. We look out for people who may be vulnerable, we look out for young people who are vulnerable, and I would hope, for instance, in this university, if there is a student who writes something pretty extreme in an essay, whether that's about a political view or a view towards women or whatever it might be, or towards gay people, there is a procedure that that lecturer knows what to do. And exactly as you say, it doesn't mean they're going to get arrested and their houses searched and computer seized, but it just means we as a society look out for vulnerable people, recognise the risk, and have good procedures to try and head off that risk.
But that's sort of ongoing and long term in terms of tackling the whole situation. In terms of the immediate threat, are you saying is that there is little more in terms of security police forces like your old force, the Greater Manchester Police, can actually do to protect the community?
I mean, some of what I've described doesn't need to be long term. Some of that can actually be happening today and be headed off today. But what was interesting again from the French situation is clearly they had put a lot more armed police officers on the street. They'd put troops on the street before what happened on Friday. And the fact is these things happen in a split second. Even if you've got lots of police officers there, by the time the police officer works out what's happening before you put in a command structure, that is half an hour. As you saw in France, it took over 2 hours for them to get into that theatre. So yes, I mean, you can have armed officers out there, but in reality, it doesn't make much of a difference. It reassures some of the public, although I sometimes, when I see lots of armed police officers out there, I feel actually more scared. But it's a difficult message to get across that, yes, obviously you need armed officers, you need good detectives, but you need really good local community relations, good community support officers, as we've got in Bolton, going out there, long-term relationships with schools, going into schools, mosques, universities, having those long-term relationships. And that's the threat, because the government is going to maintain spending on the counter-terrorist police and putting more money into MI5. But while that's going on, the money being spent on neighbourhood policing and on PCSOs, for instance, is being eroded. And that is really important in an area like this, in an area like Greater Manchester. You need to be out in the street, you need to be picking up tensions, rumours, and you need to have a long-term relationship that, as I say, when that person in that school or that member of that mosque has got a concern, they think, I know that PCSO, they're decent folk, I've had a long-term relationship with them, I'll have a chat with them. Now, and you'll do that, but you're not necessarily going to ring a complete stranger on some phone line. And that's what it's about day to day. It's good policing, it's about long-term relationships.
So putting more officers in the Trafford Centre, in Manchester United, in Manchester City, in the city centre, really does make a slight bit of difference. If somebody's going to walk in there with a gun, we're saying there's nothing you can actually do about that.
And of course, all those scenarios are gone through, Gordon, the reality, as I say, in any situation, it is so fast moving. So, in a situation like Paris, just, for instance, when that happened, no doubt there were thousands of phone calls going into the French police, trying to make sense of that. There'll be false information. You've got people pumping out stuff on social media. No doubt there were people in the theatre who themselves had managed to get onto phones and were putting messages out. Their relatives will then be phoning the police. So for you to really know what is going on, I mean, I think the French police seem to have done pretty well to get into that theatre in 2 hours, to get some sort of plan where they've got some understanding about how many attackers we've got, because that's the thing you'll be having, you know, trying to work out how many gunmen have we got here when you get all this different information and different, you know, it's just going to, it's almost an impossible task. So the idea, just by having loads of police officers out there, you can really deal with this. Is pretty fanciful, you know. If it's one person, as we've seen, you know, in some of the attacks we've had in this country, you might be able to do something.
Is the information that is coming through in this country, is it better than other countries like France are, and is it better being acted on? And the reason I ask you that question is because the Prime Minister today has said that in recent time 7 terrorist plots on this country had been foiled. Does that mean they are getting information and they're able to react better than, for instance, the French were able to do?
Certainly from what I've seen, you know, the capability of MI5 and the security services and GCHQ is of a very high order, and it's a huge protection for this country. And whether we like it or not, as I say, that's where you know, the big opportunity is, because ultimately people have to communicate. But you know, I wouldn't want to criticise the French in any way, but the fact is, you know, they have a different society, they have a different attitude between state and citizen. They have a largely paramilitary police force. The gendarmerie still lives in barracks. It is, you know, it's a very different attitude. And of course, they've also got this attitude where they say they are a secular state and they will not allow any expression of faith in the public place. So they will not allow nativity scenes outside town halls. They have this, what I think is a ridiculous battle with women wearing the veil, where you can get prosecuted for wearing the veil. Then there was a guy who was paying the fines of the women wearing the veil, and they tried to prosecute him. I just don't understand why now. And you know, clearly some people say multiculturalism has failed in this country. I profoundly disagree. I think multiculturalism has actually worked and triumphed in this country, that we've found a way of living in this country, and particularly in an area like Greater Manchester, an area like Bolton, where different cultures, different backgrounds, different nationalities on the whole can live side by side, can work together, can study together, you know, can celebrate things together. We can respect our, you know, our different traditions and our ways of life, but at the same time have fairly common values. Now, the only paradox about that is one of the British values is we're very understated, and it's very much about live and let live. And so when the government wants us to promote British values, on the whole we find that quite difficult, because one of our key values is live and let live. And you know, I say this as somebody who's first generation immigrant. My parents were both Irish, they came to this country. I think it's amazing that in one generation, I'm a chief constable, and you know, I was being made a knight of the realm. What other country could that happen in? So I think, you know, we should be proud of what we've got in Greater Manchester. We should actually celebrate it, and we should say to the rest of the world we've got our problems, but actually we're an example. And the fact that so many people can come here, and as I say, on the whole, get on pretty well. And I do think that is very different from the French model, where they've shoved, as you know, a lot of their Muslim folk into the banlieue. To be fair, their colonial experience was different, you know, and you've got to bear in mind, not all Muslims are the same. Most of their Muslims are from North Africa. It was different history from our history with people from Pakistan and Bangladesh and India. You know, but it does highlight, I think, what happened in Paris, the very stark difference. And certainly, I think over the last year, we've seen a huge increase in the information we've got from the public, but crucially, the information that we've been getting from other agencies. And I know that bodies like the National Union of Students have been against the Prevent agenda, and some of the teaching units and some of the academics have been against it. But ultimately, you know, I think that notion of building this about safeguarding, about looking out for particularly young people who may be vulnerable to being radicalised by very extreme ideologies coming from a foreign land, I think that's what any society should do. And I think that has, on the whole, been a success in this country.
And just one final question on this before we move on. When you talked about community policing being so important, having people out there to talk to people, to get information, to have a word and that sort of thing, and I think you just touched on, I want to go into this in more detail later about budget cuts, but in that particular instance, the more these budget cuts happen, presumably the less you're able to operate community policing, and therefore has it gone too far?
Well, I think on that aspect, as I say, I think the announcements today miss the crucial part that neighbourhood policing and that local relationship and that ability to have reach on the ground is what an important part it plays in counter-terrorism. Again, we can talk about it later, Gordon, but I just, I think it was a big development of my service. And it's not just about, you use the frame community policing. The Americans talk about community policing. For them, it's, an officer gets out of a police car now and again. Neighbourhood policing is about a long-term relationship. It's about a shift of power between the police and people. It's about problem solving. It's about really getting into schools, understanding your criminals, understanding the rumours, the tensions, and being in there day after day. And that's a very fundamental different form of policing. And the trouble is, if the cuts go too far, all that will happen in a place like Bolton is the police will be able to do emergency policing. So they'll turn up, if there's a serious incident in a blue light and just deal with the issue as it is then. But you're not getting the long-term problem solving, the relationship building.
And is that where we are now with the...
It's going that way. I mean, we are at a sort of tipping point. I mean, Greater Manchester Police, working with good local councils like Bolton, are bringing in changes to work in different ways, to create multidisciplinary teams, to try and hold on to that problem-solving approach, that local connection. But the danger is, it depends on what the cuts to be announced in November look like. But if they are too severe, then essentially you do end up with a police force that just does emergency policing.
But you said it will be a tipping point.
Yeah, well, it's that tipping point where neighbourhood policing just becomes a name on the door, where you might even have some local officers, but all they do is spend their time going to incidents or investigating crimes after they've happened. And therefore they're not in a position where they're going out seeking intelligence. In any community, there are a certain group of people who know what's going on. They know the criminals, they know who's active, they know the kids, they know the parents. There are other people who a bomb could go off on the road and they wouldn't know anything about it. And good policing is about how you identify those people, how you build that relationship, and how you keep that conversation going. And some of it is being alongside some of the schools and some of the teachers, being alongside when they've got difficult situations to support them. It is really fundamental stuff.
Which is under threat.
It is under threat, and I can understand how people who live in nice places in London and travel in the train don't understand this. But you go to areas like Bolton, you go to areas in Wigan, and these sort of neighbourhood officers, the PCSOs, they're right in there. They're doing things like open allotments. They're into the schools, they're understanding the tensions. They're really part of the community. Actually, the police bit doesn't matter. It's the fact they're in there as community support. They're understanding what's going on. In an area like Greater Manchester, it's just so important that you've got that reach to know what's going on. But not in a way which is a sort of a police state, which is spying or anything like that, but which is about people working together to say, with local people, to say, what are your issues, what are your problems, let's work together to solve them.
Okay, let's move away from that for now. There may be questions you'd like to put at the end of this chat, but I want to talk about you and the challenges you faced when you were Chief Constable of Manchester. And first of all, I want to talk about your retirement, because you are relatively, I would say completely, if you're comparing it with me, young, at the age of 57, and you'd been in the job 7 years, which is a reasonable amount of time, but not a huge amount of time. Why did you decide that this was the time that you'd had enough and you were going to pack it in?
Well, I mean, I was the longest serving Chief Constable in the country. What people don't realise is that Chief Constables are actually on contracts. So you get a 5-year contract. You can then get that extended. So when Tony Lloyd was elected as a Police and Crime Commissioner, I asked for an extension. He gave me an extension for 3 years. I'd done 2 years of that. I didn't want to be the guy who was in his last year when people wondering when he was going to go. I also didn't think it was fair to ask Tony for a further extension for 1 year, because at the end of the day, he'd inherited me. He'd not appointed me. But I'll be honest as well, Gordon. It's a wonderful job. It's a fascinating job. You get all sorts of opportunities, but both physically and mentally, it would, I'll be honest, it'd been getting on top of me, because it is absolutely relentless. It's 24 hours a day. You are a personality, whether you like it or not. You get a huge amount of abuse on social media 24 hours a day. You get criticised by certain politicians who make very personal comments about you. And it's just the pressure of running an organisation, which is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which just never stops. Just think of the last few weeks. We had the president of China, we had the Tory party conference with all sorts of tensions and the biggest protest we'd ever seen. All sorts of tensions about people protesting and people getting upset about it. We then had the president of China, first state visit to Manchester. And then, by the way, there's something called the Manchester Derby, where you feel like the whole of the world is watching a little bit of grass, in the city. And that's just a couple of weeks in Greater Manchester, without, a number of people in Salford shooting one another and, all that stuff going on. And as I say, and so, you've got good people who are good at dealing with that, but whether you like it or not, that pressure does get to you. And it was only really when I stepped away and made the decision that I realised what it was doing to me personally in terms of just you live your life non-stop the whole time, where you're always worrying about the next thing, where you've always got an email queue which is out of control, where you're always feeling guilty, I didn't get to see these people, or these people want a bit of my time. That's just the way. As I say, I don't want anybody to feel sorry for myself, but because it's a great job, a great opportunity.
Well, you look very relaxed and happy, but that stress and strain as the years built up as Chief Constable actually did get to you, didn't it? Seriously got to you. Yeah,
and the worst moment was when a complaint was made against me by a member of the force. The IPCC then launched an investigation. They call it a criminal investigation. They announce it to the press before they've even told you what it was all about. I was very lucky that I had Tony Lloyd, because Tony Lloyd stood up against them. They wanted me suspended. Tony Lloyd refused. But huge publicity in the press.
Was this the one about the paedophile investigation?
Yeah, the supposed paedophile investigation. Huge press publicity. In a way, fortunately, I'm sad to say that, but my mother's got dementia, so she didn't really realise what was going on. My children quite upset about it. That then becomes an 8-month investigation. I was never even interviewed. I was never told what it was all about. And suddenly you're told one day the investigation notice has been withdrawn. That's it. And of course the publicity in the paper for it being withdrawn is little. And I accept that, and there's lots of people who are investigated, and the police investigate lots of people. But when you are a public figure having to make very difficult decisions day in, day out, whether you like it or not, that does get to you, because you get a degree of publicity which would not be applied to other people.
But it got to you to the extent that you sought counselling.
Yeah, and that was just, in Greater Manchester Police, we're always dealing with difficult situations, so officers that have been through traumatic situations, but also officers that are under long-term investigation. We offer counselling, and I took that up and found it very useful, not actually about the investigation, but more about realising, what living a mad 24-hour existence was doing to me, and also allowing me absolutely to confront the situation that at some point you're going to have to make a decision, Peter, to leave policing, and it helped me just to make that decision. And
was it affecting your family and
Yeah, I mean, I've got a wonderful wife, Jenny, who's incredibly accommodating, if anything, too accommodating. But no, it was getting to that. And, I think, probably as people in this audience can identify it when your partner says, well, you're here, but you're not here, and will you please shut that bloody thing off, where you're just sitting there looking at your BlackBerry or your email queue, or you're just, something that happened that day or you're going to deal with tomorrow is so busily going around your head that you're not actually concentrating on anything, or, Yeah. And I think that is, but the bit that worries me, Gordon, is, when I didn't leave, only 2 people applied for my job. Ian, who's got the job, is a wonderful individual. I've worked with him for the last 10 years, but when I got the job, 4 pretty good chief constables competed for the job. There was only 2 people applied for my job, only 1 person applied for the chief constable of West Midlands. And what worries you is, these jobs get so demanding that good people don't want to do them.
Is it too big for one man or one woman?
Well, I certainly think, to try and do it long term, and it's certainly, if you're going to do the job or apply for the job, you have to realise this is going to take quite a toll.
But you must have had a fair idea. You've just been, I know it's not quite the same, but you've just been Chief Constable of Cheshire for 6 years, and you must have known you were going to the bigger.
I absolutely do not want anybody to feel sorry for me, because I absolutely loved the job, and it was the most amazing privilege to be the Chief Constable. But I think what changed in my time, Gordon, was probably 3 things. More and more 24-hour news. So this thing is going around relentlessly. If you want to be, you can be on the Manchester Evening News website 24 hours a day, worrying about what's happening at GMP and what our image is. The other thing is the advent of social media, and not just, again, the sheer amount, but the way that now people can abuse you anonymously on social media. I know some people call it trolling, but again, the ability for people, to, even including your own staff, to set up websites which you cannot touch. I mean, this man is not in here, and then just abuse you. And actually, it didn't get to me so much because I would just not watch it. But quite a number of my staff were severely affected and would come to me and say, you're my employer, you've got a duty of care to stop me in being abused in this way. And me saying, look, just don't watch it, don't look at that website, don't turn on Twitter, it doesn't work. So that changed. I think the other thing was, I think, the quality of the public discourse. So clearly I had two particular local MPs who were not number ones in my fan club. And what gets to you is really the personal abuse.
Graham Stringer,
who said I was more of a social worker than a police officer, and what we needed was a real copper. And if that means I cared about the causes of crime, I plead guilty to that. And that and then my dear friend Simon Danchuk, who when I said that there's a lot of people who have poor upbringing ends up in the criminal justice system, said that showed why I was unsuitable to be a chief constable. I mean, I just don't know why you need the personal abuse. If Simon wants to debate how the criminal justice system works, and particularly how the youth justice system works, and why certain families constantly feature and go round and round in cycles, I'm happy to debate that with him. But just to throw in personal abuse as a cheap soundbite, that's what actually makes the job harder. When you get in that, you obviously have a thick skin and you brush it off, but it's that sort of thing which I think make other people look at the job and say, why would I want to do it?
Did you ever come close to resigning before you actually made the decision?
No, absolutely not.
Particularly at that time?
No, absolutely not. No, I'm very, very proud of what I did. And I wouldn't want anybody to think I didn't love any minute. Being the chief is amazing. Every single day is different. You're dealing with some of the most intractable social problems in a world city. You have a absolutely wonderful workforce that inspires you every single day. You put your heart and soul into it, but I don't miss it, and I'm pleased that I've now walked away.
When you took over at GMP, you had a whole range of major challenges to deal with. Things like gang warfare, which was particularly heavy at that time, all the shootings that were going on that led to the city getting the unfortunate nickname of Gunchester, the child sex abuse gangs, the racial tensions in our society, counter-terrorism, which you talked about, and so on. What was the most difficult for you to tackle?
The most difficult was going into Greater Manchester Police. The previous Chief Constable, as you may remember, had sadly died in very difficult circumstances. GMP had actually sadly killed one of their own officers in a training incident, PCE in Terry. So the force was in quite a lot of turmoil, really, Gordon. And it also come through a very difficult history at that time, which was an obsession with statistics and performance indicators. And because of the size of GMP and the nature of Greater Manchester, the force had always been at the bottom of the league table. And that had led to a very transactional, reactive form of leadership, which was just obsessed with targets, was obsessed with getting figures. You're allowed 5 burglaries this week. The really bizarre behaviour, really. And probably the biggest challenge was realising it had to shift that culture and bring in a much more thoughtful, community-based form of policing, but at the same time being under huge pressure from the government, and at that time the Police Standards Unit. And at one point, myself and Paul Murphy, now the Lord Mayor of Manchester, who was then the chair of the Police Authority, we were in front of Her Majesty's Inspectorate, who basically said, you either achieve these targets or somebody else can come in and run the police force. And so that was a real challenge to try and improve performance, but not in a way which actually was just reinforcing the negative aspects of the culture of GMP. And that was to some degree a challenge for, 3 or 4 years, because that whole performance culture had got so ingrained in the whole culture of GMP, and I can't tell you how difficult that was. I mean, anybody that knows GMP at that time, when we were in the old headquarters at Chester House, at the end of the top floor was what was called the grip room, which was essentially where Mike Todd had all the borough commanders in a big square.
Previous Chief Constable.
Previous Chief Constable, with 4 television screens on which he used to put the statistics up, and then berate, if not bully, commanders that were not achieving their targets. And of course that behaviour then filtered right the way through the organisation. And to actually shift that was an enormous challenge. And indeed, some of the difficulties we had with cases like Rochdale was because it had been a force that had been obsessed with property crime and statistics and league tables. And to actually shift it to a force which our number one priority is to protect vulnerable people was incredibly difficult, because you actually almost have to, it's a bit like if you're renovating your house, you almost, if you've had some horrible infestation, you have to renew all the floorboards and almost rewire the place. It almost felt like that that you almost had to completely rewire and think really profoundly about some of the signs and symbols.
I mean, the GMP was being condemned from many areas, even from within its own ranks at that time, of failing to act in child sex abuse allegations, and about reluctance to make arrests, and indeed of cover-ups. Now, much of that time was before you came to take charge. But you are saying there is some truth in that, and how did you then set about changing it?
I mean, I'm not saying that statistics and the performance culture was all the excuse. I mean, it was a more profound issue, which I think is still there in broader society, Gordon, particularly about how we regard children who have difficult upbringings and keep on running away from care. And that is still an issue for us. And so the difficulty in places like Rochdale had a mindset which had developed between with the police and the social services and the Crown Prosecution Service, where certain young people were sort of written off that they had a particular lifestyle, which meant that if they went into the court system, they would never be believed. And the trouble is that although the attitudes in the police and social services have changed, actually a lot of the attitudes in the criminal justice system have not changed. And that is still a huge challenge. So in terms of changing that, turning that round, as I say, you have to look at all your managers, you have to look at the leaders, you have to look at the symbols in the organisations, you have to look at the messages you're giving out, you have to profoundly look at what you're measuring. And we had to just massively shift the way that every single day in GMP, what was the conversation between leaders, managers, and the people doing the job, which really fundamentally put protecting vulnerable people right there at the core. And to that extent, almost, said property crime is no longer a priority because you've got to put vulnerable people first, and it's just a huge leadership challenge to actually achieve that degree of change, particularly when you've got to do this with a existing workforce. You can't clear a load out and bring new ones in, and you're having to do this, and also in a way where if you've got a court system that doesn't shift, you've got a dissonance. So it's been interesting, or sad in a way, that some of the recent rape victims that we've dealt with have said, got great support from the police were absolutely wonderful, we got counselling, we had victim support, we had all these agencies helping us, and then we went into the courtroom and it was like this. Suddenly I was hit with a totally different culture where it felt like I was being attacked and raped all over again. And that's because, and I feel quite strongly about this, I talked in the public lecture last week in Manchester about this, is that the way that the legal system is set up at the moment, the accusatorial system that we have, where if you've got weaknesses as the way they would see it in your background, about your upbringing, about previous history, about perhaps an alcohol problem or a drug problem, if you have kept on going back to the person who was abusing you, then sadly that will be used against you in the court process. But that is actually in the nature of a lot of the victims. A lot of the victims, it's their very nature that they've come through abusive relationships, which mean they keep on going back to their abuser. And I just think we need, and that's my exhortation to the University of Manchester and to this one in a way, we need a bigger debate and we need research into what are the alternative ways of actually dealing with this. Because we've had with the case in London, first the police are criticised for not believing victims, and then in the Lee and Britton case, we're then criticised for believing too readily. And I think it's disappointing when all that debate is going on and we're lurching from one way to the other to say, well, no, actually, what might have to be examined here is the basic legal system that is trying to deal with these sorts of cases, which was largely designed in Victorian times, if not before, but the issue is research and societal attitudes and the way that people conduct relationships has fundamentally changed. And my feeling is the way that we do investigations, the way that society then examines those cases, has not in any way changed to keep up with that.
We have a number of legal people here in our audience tonight, including a judge, so they may want to put some questions to you on that shortly. We could be here for an hour and a half, but I want to get into a couple of other areas. The budget cuts, because I've got particular interest in how you, as a Chief Constable, dealt with them, just to get the facts and figures straight, and you will have them better than me researching from a newspaper. When you joined the GMP, approximately what was the size of your force?
We certainly had 8,200 police officers.
And what was your budget, roughly?
I think it was about £660 million, yeah.
Right. And after the various cuts and things, when you left, what was the size of your police force?
We were down to 6,300 police officers, and I think the budget was around about 550 million.
And that is, and the strength, the man force, the strength of the force is going to drop further with the next round.
Yeah, I mean, the prediction is certainly to go down to about 5,000, if not below. It depends on what the Chancellor announces.
It's nearly half.
Yeah.
So can a police force cope when they've lost half their strength?
Well, I think the issue, Gordon, is if a chief constable, a grumpy chief constable, goes into the media to complain about the cuts, the Home Office always put out two lines: crime is down and police reform is working. Now, number one, crime is down, but actually the police deal with a lot more than crime. So it's a complete red herring. The second thing is we've actually had very little police reform. We've had some reform of police governance. The police authority has been replaced by the Police and Crime Commissioner. You talked about ACPO. Well, actually, ACPO is now the National Police Chiefs Council. We used to have a Serious and Organised Crime Agency. That's now called the National Crime Agency. We used to have a National Police Improvement Agency. That's now called the College of Policing. Mars is now called Snickers, or whatever it was, or Marathon is called Snickers. So, my point is, Gordon, I think what is disappointing about this whole debate, and I do think it actually applies to a degree to local authorities, is we've had lots of cuts. We've had very little real reform. The way we've actually asked to produce and provide services has not changed. So when I had my very last day out on patrol in Greater Manchester Police, I still had a pocketbook to write things in. But actually the basic way we deliver policing has not changed. So again, at the weekend, apparently David Cameron has complained to the Chief Constable there that they were thinking of closing one of his police stations. Now, I think it's disappointing in this day and age we're still talking about police stations, because whether we like it or not, the world has moved on. And now what we're really interested in is actually sharing facilities with local councils in a very different fundamental way. So your question about cuts is you can reshape a business in a very different way, in the way that journalism has had to reshape, broadcasting has had to reshape, whatever. Yeah, people making cars have had to reshape. You can do that and you can cut your costs. But you need, number one, you need your customers to understand that it's going to fundamentally change, that there's no point, you don't go into your bank branch, you can do it all just as well online now. And you need your politicians to be saying to the public, this service is going to change. And what you're used to is going to get to change. And politicians that are willing to really drive through radical change. And I don't think we haven't had that. We haven't had that. We haven't had national politicians saying to the public, you can't expect the state to sort out all your problems. And we've not had that driving through. We still have 43 police sources. We still have a very traditional rank structure in policing. There's been no reform, almost no reform of the police workforce, of the way that they're paid and rewarded, despite the fact that the world has become a far more complicated place. I could go on and on and on. So, it's the trouble is you can have a very traditional conversation to say, can a police force succeed with half the number of officers? Well, no, absolutely it can't if it's going to try and provide the service in the same way it always had. But that is the wrong conversation, because what we did when we had the cuts, Gordon, is the first thing you do is you're going to have a lot less smaller workforce, so you've got to have less demand. When you looked at where our demand came from, it was going back to the same families, the same individuals time and time again. Nearly again, on my last day in GMP, went into Trafford Police Station, talking to an officer, what are you dealing with? He was dealing with a woman who'd contacted us 250 times in the previous year. A woman on the edge of mental health issues. I won't go into what she was complaining about because you might identify her, but I have real difficulty in going to the public to say I need more money when I've got an officer dealing with somebody who's contacted us 250 times and we didn't find a way of working with the local authority and with the health service to say, after 10 times, we've now wasted enough time on this situation, can we please sort it? And that's really what the devolution agreement is about. That's why it's so exciting, because it gives opportunities in a place like Bolton to say, here's one pot of money. Let's not have police, social services, all the rest of it working in different offices to different agendas, often to Whitehall. Let's have them working together in a fundamentally different way as to what is the greatest harm in Bolton. And I'm not saying what's the greatest crime, I'm saying what is the greatest harm. And if the greatest harm is in Bolton is kids not going to school through truancy, which is harming their life chances and ruining the economy of Bolton, great. Well, then the police force should have that as one of their priorities. And it's that sort of approach. If the big issue is illegal money lending because it's absolutely undermining the good people of Bolton and some of the more deprived estates, great, please, go after that. And that's the big opportunity that the devolution agreement offers us.
And that whole area of devolution, you are clearly excited about and interested about. and you've already talked about it, and you want local mayors to be in charge of courts, prisons and the Crown
Absolutely,
Prosecution
yep.
Service. So why will that, in the end, make it better than it is?
Well, number one, I think the Crown Prosecution Service, I think that should have to take into account more local priorities, but it will also give Tony Lloyd the opportunity, for instance, to give more money to the Crown Prosecution Service so that we wouldn't have such huge delays, which then naturally create costs for the police and for the court system. Most of our, and I'm not talking about Strangeways, but if you look at a prison like Forest Bank in Salford, the vast majority are local criminals who are going to be going back to Salford and Bolton. And if we actually had that budget within Greater Manchester, again, there could be a great incentive to actually put a lot more community sentences and work in a fundamentally different way, and even come up with imaginative sentences, like you don't have to go to prison for 4 weeks, but you might have to go to prison for each weekend, I don't know. But it would give us that opportunity to work out with one pot of money what's actually the best way of actually solving this. I wouldn't advocate the Crown Courts going as part of the devolution, but again, the local courts, magistrates' courts, are again working with the same individuals, the same families, coming in and out of the court system. And if we were able to tie that up to the sort of problem-solving work with troubled families and other individuals, and try and address not, did you steal the bottle of whiskey from Sainsbury's this morning, but rather, why have you got a long-term lifestyle of nuisance, criminal behaviour, antisocial behaviour? If that's what the court was concentrated on, then I think that would be a much better service. And again, would actually take a lot of cost out, because we wouldn't be churning people in and out of the prison system. When we looked at so many families in Greater Manchester, what really struck us, what goes through nearly all of them, sadly, is domestic violence. Why? Because sadly, domestic violence then means that children don't get the right attachment when they're very, very young. We know that their brains then develop much more slowly within their skull. They then underachieve at school, and they then become, sadly, the next criminals and often the next abusers. And the other issue we noticed was that whenever a member of those families went into prison, when they came out again, their offending went up another notch. They just got more disruptive and more criminal. Now, you can afford to do that when you've got lots of money, but I would suggest that when money is tight, not a great way to actually be spending your money. We should actually be trying to identify those patterns and address them in a different way.
You're now retired.
No, I've left policing. I'm not retired. Left
You've
policing.
retired from 34 years in the police force.
Yeah.
When you walked out of that building for the last time, how emotional was that? All your 34 years of
I don't know, God. I mean, it was nice. People, they all turned out and they clapped me, and I was trying to feel emotional, and I tried to feel emotional when I put my uniform for the last time, and I tried to feel emotional when I put my medals for the last time, and I got the honors I didn't.
You didn't?
The only emotion I felt was liberation, I'm free. And I sent a text to my kids that evening, I'm free, exclamation. And I don't, in no way, I love policing, I love being chief constable, but no, and I think part of it was the very next day I was walking into a job which I feel very passionate about, which is something I believe in.
Retrack.
I think if I was going home to get the pipe and slippers out, then I probably would.
Why are you so passionate about Retrack?
Because it's the same issue about vulnerable children that we were dealing with here in Manchester. And when you go out to Africa, you see in a city like Kampala, 7,000 children sleeping on the street every single night, some as young as 5 years old. You get passionate about that, and you think this is something you could try and concentrate on and see if you can actually change the system. And it's just the chance of working in a very different organisation. Yeah.
The last question, before I see if there's anyone who'd like to put questions to you here, it's what I ask every guest who sits in that seat there, who are always people who have reached the very top and had a very distinguished career, and are an inspiration to young people about to go out on their career paths, like the students here at this university and so on. What's your advice to them? What should be the key drivers for them as they set out on this career trail?
First thing I would say to any young person who has that conversation, grab every opportunity. A lot of people told me about work-life balance. Not a great fan of work-life balance, not great, I think if you get an opportunity, why I've worked in 5 police forces is because I saw opportunities and grabbed them. If anybody, I think most people know, if anybody invited me to anything in Greater Manchester, if at all possible, I tried to go. And because it was always, you felt a bit bad, God, why did I agree to this? And then you went to the event and it was always wonderful and you met nice people and all the rest of it. So grab every opportunity. Try and work out what it is you don't know about the world. So, if you've never been in a mosque, if you've never been in a synagogue, if you've never met this type of people, then try and, build those experiences, and through that be good at communication. And I think for me they are the key things really. It is about that ability to communicate. I hopefully was the sort of person who could absolutely meet the Queen, which was an enormous privilege, and at the same time go in a drug addict's house in Bolton and be able to relate and have a conversation, and fundamentally as well have respect for them and not look down upon them. And I think that's a massive thing, is that ability. And it's not easy, and it's something I had to work at, but it is that ability to just go into somebody's house, perhaps somebody going through a really difficult time, somebody grieving, or you're a member of staff who's a little bit, a member of your own staff who's a bit overawed because suddenly the Chief Constable's walked into the office, and you very quickly you're able to put them at ease, find out what they're doing, and hopefully get something useful out of them, in terms of how they're feeling. I think that's the sort of thing which is worth developing.
Sir Peter Fahy, ladies and gentlemen.